Hello, this is Miss Rao, and today's video is going to be on how to approach literary analysis in your IB literature course. Before we start, please make sure you have pen and paper to take notes, preferably in a variety of colors. You might need to pause the video at this point to go get those items. This information will be valuable not only for your HLSA, but also for your individual oral and the 2 papers you're going to write in May. And to be honest, it should be valuable for any kind of literary analysis writing you may need to do, either for the IB, for AP, for high school, or for college. This is the first in a series of videos I will be making. It's also my first time using this platform, so please bear with me. And here we go. The first thing we need to do is we need to define what we mean by literary analysis. So literary analysis is an in-depth look at what something means and how it works. So this is the first thing we're going to be looking at. And when we do literary analysis, we make an assumption. The assumption that we're making is that literature is important, that literary works offer the reader something of value, something that deserves careful consideration, something in which it is worthy of our analysis. And this is important because without this assumption, we are just simply wasting our time. So I'm going to circle this right here. We're going to talk about these literary works because we have to define, well, what do we mean by literary works? We said that literary analysis is an in-depth look at what something means and how it works. And now we've said that a literary work offers the reader something of value, something worthy. And this word something keeps coming up. So we have to go, well, what is this something? And really, what are we talking about when we say literary works? Which ones? Who makes this decision? What makes something of literary value? And essentially what we're saying, what makes it of literary value is the fact that it has value. We're saying it is something of value about it. So what do we mean when we say something of value about a literary work? So let's think, what are the kinds of things that might have value in a literary work? When we're reading a literary work, we might see that it deals with human nature. So as we read a work, we might go, oh, wow, this makes me think about human nature. I felt this way when I was reading Frankenstein for the first time. And I felt so sad for Frankenstein because human nature was to abhor him because of his physicality. So it definitely explored the idea of human nature. Another thing might be politics. Maybe the book goes heavily into politics. We have a lot of books like 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale that do that. Maybe it deals with justice. I know To Kill a Mockingbird deals heavily with the idea of justice. Or technology. We've got books like Fahrenheit 451 or any of the short stories by Ray Bradbury that deal with technology. It might have something of value to say about language. 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale both have a lot to say about language and the value of language. Maybe it has something to say about relationships, like in Of Mice and Men, a novel that deals with relationship of 2 best friends. It might have something to do with culture. If you listen to the music of Kendrick Lamar, he deals a lot with this idea of culture. It might have something to do with history. I'm watching a TV series now called Man in the High Castle that deals with history and asks questions, what if, with history. We also have isms. Isms are things that are like social constructs or ideas. It could be socialism. We might be dealing with something like Animal Farm that is dealing with this idea of communism. It could also be religion. We could also be dealing with identity, something that I think a lot of the books that I just mentioned dealt with. So one thing we need to know is that this list can just keep going on and on and on and on, and we don't have time for that. So I think you get the idea of what I mean when I say that it has to have something of value, okay? So we have to think about what we mean when we say literary analysis then. So we talked already about the first idea, which is this, what literary analysis is and the assumptions that are making. But now we need to look at, well, what's the second thing that we're dealing with literary analysis? So with this second thing that we're dealing with, let me recenter my screen here, is this idea that you, and when I say you, I am talking about the writer, because when you do literary analysis, you become the writer. First you were the reader, you read the piece, you came up with some ideas about it, but now you've become the writer. And as the writer, you have power to focus your intellect on what matters most to you. And this is really important because as a reader, you are taking in information, but as the writer, you get to say something about what you read, and you get to do this in conjunction with the author. You get to say something meaningful, and you are essentially working with the author to say whatever it is that you think is meaningful. In many ways, what you're doing is teaming up. This is awesome. If you think about the power that this gives you, you get to team up with the author. This is really exciting. I find this very exciting because you read something, you take it in, you have all these ideas about it, and then you get to use your intellect and think, what matters to me? What is there something that I want to say that's meaningful? And you team up with the author to do this. So the question is, how are you teaming up with the author? So you are the one who gets to do the interpretation. You're interpreting the work, and you're the one who is interpreting the theme. And the theme really is the key here. What is the theme of the work? You are the one who gets to perceive what the theme of the work is. And you're going to use the work itself as the evidence. And this is you teaming up with the author. You essentially have formed a partnership with the author. The author has written something, you have interpreted it. You're then to work with the author to come up with your idea and then to put it down on paper. And that is exactly what literary analysis is. What you perceive as the theme. Once again, this idea of theme is very important. So you're working with the author. All right, so how do we do this? So there are a dozen different ways, so many different ways of doing this, and there are tons of possibilities. Because if you think about it, the possibilities are endless, because a great novel doesn't just deal with one theme. A great piece of literature doesn't generally just deal with one theme. There are multiple themes, there's multiple subjects, and there's multiple interpretations of each. So even though there might be 36 kids in a classroom that all read the same work, it is completely possible that we have 36 completely different papers. So the first thing you have to do is you have to decide on the subject. So once you decide on the subject, you have to ask yourself the question, what is the author trying to say about that subject? Okay, so once you do that, you ask yourself the question, okay, so you first decide what is the subject, and you ask yourself, well, what is the author trying to say about the subject? And this then becomes the theme. So what the author is trying to say about the subject becomes the theme. And this is the general pattern that we are using. So for today's class, the example that I'm going to use is Of Mice and Men. You should have read this your freshman year. So first you have to decide, well, what is the subject? Okay, so let me write this down, Of Mice and Men. And we're going to say that the subject of it is friendship and caring for others. So then you have to think to yourself, well, what is the author trying to say about friendship? What is he trying to say about caring for others? And this is actually a very complex idea because throughout the novel, there are multiple areas where this is dealt with. And then ultimately, let's say you decide, you come up with that sometimes caring for someone means protecting them. And then you think, well, it's more complicated than that. So maybe protecting them even if it is painful to do so. So when we do this, we're then going from subject to theme. And then once we have the theme, we can start thinking about, well, what is it that I'm actually going to write about? Now we're going to move on to the 7 concepts. And the 7 concepts deal directly with the IB. At this point, if you want to pause, you can go ahead and pause and take a short break, and then come right back to the video, please. Well, hopefully you got yourself a short break, and now we're going to go back to taking our notes. So we are now moving on to our 7 concepts. We have 7 concepts in IB: creativity, culture, identity, representation, communication, perspective, and transformation. So we ask you, when you look at literature, especially when you're going to be writing about it or discussing it, that you try to look at through one of these lenses of conceptual understanding. We also have 5 fields of inquiry. And inquiry means to ask questions, to inquire about something. And the 5 fields of inquiry that we ask you to focus on in IB are right here. They are culture and identity and community, belief, values, and education, politics, power, and justice, art, creativity, and the imagination, and science, technology, and the environment. So when you are asking yourself a question about what you've written, we want you to consider these 5 fields of inquiry. And these 5 fields of inquiry are what's connected to that highlighted word earlier about something. Is there something of value? So when there is something of value, a lot of times it will connect to these ideas here. So the 5 fields of inquiry are what are going to help you connect what you've read to something of value. And we will go into more depth into the 5 fields of inquiry in my next video. So when we're writing a literary analysis essay, we need to see the connections between the 7 concepts and the 5 fields of inquiry. And these connections go both directions. And if we're looking at the 7 concepts and our 5 fields of inquiry, we're going to find that we're doing lots of thinking. In fact, we are doing significant amounts of thinking. This thinking is very meaningful. And by doing this thinking and using our brain, we are able to come up with the ideas that we're going to use in our paper. If you're not spending lots of time thinking about these ideas, and if your thinking isn't significant and meaningful, then your paper is not going to be significant and meaningful. So lots of thinking, lots of significant and meaningful thinking is what's going to lead to your literary analysis essay. So what kind of essay is a literary analysis? A literary analysis is a persuasive argument. So in order to write a persuasive argument, we need a couple of things. So as I said earlier, your topic and thesis are worthy of investigation, worthy of being written about. This is very important because if it's not worthy, then there's no reason to write about it. And then the other thing that's important is that your interpretation needs to be correct. Now, there are many correct responses, but there's also many wrong responses. Your understanding of it is very important. And how do you know whether or not your interpretation is correct? Well, it's because it's supported by evidence. It's supported by the author's words. And this is what I was saying earlier about you working in conjunction with the author. The literary work itself is going to support what you have to say. So when you write an essay like this, you end up with a high level of formality. This paper is going to be highly formal. And the reason for this is because the paper is highly organized. And it's highly organized because it is complicated. So when you write about complicated ideas, you end up with a high level of formality and you end up with a highly organized paper. So remember that significant and meaningful thinking. Because you did that significant and meaningful thinking, what's happened is that you've created a complicated idea. These complicated ideas do not go down on paper easily. High level of formality, highly organized. In addition, it uses precise language. You have to use precise language. Why? Because it is complicated. If your paper doesn't use precise language, it will be difficult to follow. In addition, it uses evidence. Where does this evidence come from? It comes from the text itself. When you do literary analysis, there is no reason to do outside research. You are simply bringing together your ideas with evidence from the text. Your important ideas, your important and meaningful thinking, your important and meaningful ideas. So now what? You have everything together. Now what do you do? Well, that totally depends on where you are in the class and what your teacher asks you to do, if you're in HL Year 1 or HL Year 2. But in general, it is time for you to think about what topics interest you, what themes you have ideas about, and what connections you can make to the IB concepts. All right, so at this point, I'm going to say see you in class, and this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.